So joining us now to break down the conversation being had on college campuses is Ophelie Jacobson, a reporter at Campus Reform. So Ophelie, I first want to start on a video that I saw that you did as well. I suggest all of our viewers go to Campus Reform, view some of your content itself, because there are some things that just can't necessarily be portrayed through conversation. You have to see it to believe it. But when it comes to the issue of student loan debt, what were different students saying on college campuses about that prospect?
Absolutely. So students are a big fan of this plan. I've talked to dozens of college students about canceling student loan debt. And what I found is that they recognize that this is an important issue for them. A lot of students express that they believe education should be a right. And for that reason, they shouldn't be forced to succumb to thousands of dollars in student loans. And for many, this was also a personal issue as well. They were either taking out loans or they knew of students and even their parents who were still paying off their loans from getting a degree. These college students, frankly, don't want to pay off their student loans. So when they hear of a plan that has the potential to wipe all of this away, it's no surprise that they're quick to support it.
And, I understand why. It's a very appealing thing for someone who has student loans taken out. I, for example, am paying student loans, but I also have friends who went to, for example, a community college for 2 years and then paid off their student loans that way. And I hear their arguments, too, and they're very valid. They say, well, then what was I doing by, for example, being financially responsible, working during school as well to pay off these type of debts? I understand why they're frustrated about the prospect of now their taxpayer money going to paying off other people's student loans. So when you talk to these college students as well, do they recognize that mentality, or do they provide any sort of, strategy moving forward of how to pay for these expansive programs?
Right. And I think that is a big question that a lot of Americans are asking is where will this money come from? And I part of the reason why I did this video was to find out if the same students who were so supportive of the plan would also be willing to contribute their own money in order to pay for the bill. And a lot of students even offered suggestions. Some students told me that they wanted to defund the police and tax the rich in order to pay for the student loan debt crisis. These are typical answers that you would expect to receive on campuses nowadays. But at the end of the day, in reality, this money will be coming out of taxpayers' pockets. So to put it into more simpler terms, I calculated that with 328.2 million Americans in this country, if everyone were to theoretically pay $5,183, we would be able to eliminate all $1.7 trillion of student loan debt. So I went around with these fake pledges to see if these students would be able to sign to pay that $5,000 to contribute to paying the bill. And unsurprisingly, they were not. So the same students who were so supportive of the plan, they were not willing to contribute their own money to help pay for the crisis.
It's funny how that works, but I think that speaks to a lot of these issues, for example, because I remember when Elizabeth Warren was running too, she said she taxed the rich in order to pay for whether it's Medicare for all, Green New Deal, things of that nature, but the price tag just still didn't match up. And then when you talk to these students as well, I think it brings up a question as to whether or not this is generational or if this is just a life lesson that they have to learn. What's that old saying, for example, if you're not liberal when you're young, you have no heart. If you're not conservative when you're older, you have no brain. Do you think that this changes, for example, when these students start getting a job, making an income, and then having to start paying taxes on that income? Do you think that's when their mentality will shift?
Right. And I think that's interesting to point out. It'll be interesting to see what these students will do when they grow up and enter into adulthood, what beliefs they'll take with them and how their perspective will change. And I certainly hope that when these students, like you mentioned, start making an income and paying their taxes, they'll start to realize that people need to take personal responsibility for their own actions. And another thing we've noticed with this generation specifically is the tendency to jump behind a movement without knowing the full picture. At the Leadership Institute's Campus Reform, we've seen how students will jump behind a slogan, whether that be defund the police or cancel student loan debt, but they don't even know how to answer simple questions about the basis of the plan. For example, where this money would come from. And it's partly due to the fact that these politicians, when they're presenting the plan to cancel student loan debt, they're leaving out key details and they're not giving students the full picture. You have representatives like AOC that are just tweeting that student loan forgiveness is good, and now she's selling shirts that say cancel student debt. It's a cute slogan on a t-shirt, but canceling student loan debt is a bit more complicated than that. So unfortunately, these students aren't getting the full picture, and that's something that we've seen in this generation specifically.
And I think that when we talk about canceling student loan debt, a big part of this conversation is left out, and it's the idea that you're not getting to the root of the problem. If you were to get rid of all student loan debt right now, you're just hitting the reset button on that, and eventually the next generation of kids will keep racking up student loan debt at these expensive universities if nothing changes. It's a Band-Aid on a much bigger issue. So when we look at this issue as well, what do you think the conservative response should be? Because I understand, for example, why it's very appealing for politicians to tell young people, we'll get rid of that debt. I understand why that's appealing, but do you think conservatives need to put a greater emphasis on school choice or trade crafts, community college, for example, things that could alleviate some of the financial burdens, at the same time providing a pathway to a very promising career?
Absolutely. I think conservatives need to push the agenda that at the end of the day, attending a school or a university is a personal decision. Getting a degree should be a well thought out and personal choice. And young people really need to take the time to sit down with their families, to sit down with their parents and look at their finances. They need to first consider whether or not they even need a degree in the first place. And second of all, if the program they're going to enroll in will be worth the cost. In other words, will their chosen career path be able to pay for the cost of education in a reasonable amount of time? In my circumstance, I chose to stay in state and attend a public university, the University of Florida, to avoid student loan debt. I had the option and the opportunity to attend an out of state private university that would have cost me upwards of $80,000 a year. But knowing that down the road, I didn't want to pay all of that money, I chose to stay in state and get a great education with a cheaper price tag. So again, it goes back to the idea and the argument of fairness. Why should I have to pay for the student loans of others who voluntarily chose to go to a more expensive school when I chose to go to a cheaper school to avoid doing just that? It isn't fair. At the end of the day, attending a school or a university isn't a personal choice. And so for that reason, it should be a personal responsibility to find where the money would come from.
And I think any teacher can speak to this. No student is the same. I mean, no future is the same for any of those students, and their pathway to a career is not always the same either. I mean, even parents. I know my parents would say this. No kid in our household was the exact same. And to say that there's a boilerplate type of thing that every parent, every teacher, every institution, I guess for that matter, should be following, it just doesn't work. And I think that it's time that we start recognizing that fact, because there are ways to have very promising careers without that piece of paper that says you went to a 4-year school. I think that's something where we need to break down the stigma a little bit more so we can move ahead. But Ophelie Jacobson, I really appreciate you coming on the show tonight and breaking down what the conversation is on college campuses. Thank you.